Among the most contentious pharaohs of ancient Egypt, Akhenaten, born Amenhotep IV, ruled from 1353 to 1336 BC. He broke with the traditional Egyptian pantheon of gods and established his own monotheism, the worship of Aten, the sun disk, as the one and only deity. Of course, with this change came the establishment of a new capital city, Akhenaten, where he erected numerous palaces and temples devoted entirely to the new god. During his rule, new artistic styles emerged in Egypt, departing from the idealized forms of earlier periods, a new style featuring figures with long, androgynous bodies and exaggerated facial features. In sharp contrast to the more ceremonial portrayals of his predecessors, Akhenaten also altered his own representation, which frequently featured him in close-up and informal situations surrounded by his family. But when he passed away, his capital was deserted, his monuments demolished, and his name was removed from the official lists of kings, effectively wiping him out of history. Although his legacy was later attempted to be erased, the reign of Akhenaten is still a captivating window into a time of great cultural turmoil in ancient Egypt, and we will do our best to piece it together from the bits that we have left. Welcome to the channel. For the newcomers, good to meet you. Those returning, great to have you back. Another ancient Egypt one today. I'm sure you enjoy that. I always get lots of requests to do these sorts of videos. And once again, before we start, if you want to help YouTube push the channel out, the like and subscribe button helps with that, and leaving a comment. And anyone who wants to support the channel can look in the video description. Now, without further ado, let's get busy. Very little is known about the early life as Prince Amenhotep by Egyptologists. Much of it was either not documented or simply destroyed. But based on the birth of Akhenaten's first daughter, who was likely born fairly early in his own reign, we can use a little bit of maths and a slight sprinkling of guesswork to estimate his birth to be before the 25th regnal year as his father, Amenhotep III, which was approximately 1363 to 1361 BC. Now, a solitary reference to his identity labeled as the king's son Amenhotep was discovered on a wine receipt, of all places, at Amenhotep III's Malkata Palace, leading certain historians to propose that Akhenaten was actually born there. Well, there are others who argue that he was born in Memphis, and that his upbringing was shaped by the nearby worship of the sun god Ra, which was prevalent in Heliopolis. Now, of course, Heliopolis, you might have caught that. We have Helio, sun, polis, city, city of the sun. Of course, it's for Ra, right? And then later on in his life, Aten being the sun disk. Well, perhaps it's all about childhood nostalgia. In fact, the cult of Ra was so prevalent and firmly established across Egypt that Akhenaten could have been solely influenced by this solar worship, regardless of whether he had a background in Heliopolis. Well, historians have attempted to ascertain the identity of Akhenaten's tutor during his formative years, which is a challenge in itself. Several names have been put forward, such as the scribe's Tiye II, who was the royal tutor of Amenhotep, and also Hekareshu, Paranepher is the sole individual whose service to the prince is confirmed, and we know this because it's carved in the rock of their tomb. So there you go. Well, Prince Amenhotep may have held the position of High Priest of Ptah in Memphis. Although no corroborating evidence has been discovered of this, it is suggested by one Egyptologist, Cyril Aldred. But we do know that Amenhotep's brother, Crown Prince Thutmose, previously held this position until his death. If Amenhotep assumed all of his brother's responsibilities in anticipation of his ascension to the throne, he could have potentially taken on the position of a high priest in place of his brother. Akhenaten's distinctive artistic preferences also may have been influenced by his association with Ptah, the deity revered by artisans, whose leading priests were occasionally known as the supreme authorities in craftsmanship. Now on to the debate regarding whether Amenhotep IV assumed the throne of Egypt immediately after the death of his father, Amenhotep III. Do you remember Amenhotep IV was Akhenaten's old name? Or if there was a period of joint rule, potentially lasting up to 12 years. Some vehemently oppose the idea of a lengthy co-regency between the two rulers, advocating for none at all, or at least one that lasts a maximum of 2 years. Well, in 2014, archaeologists discovered the names of both pharaohs engraved on the wall of Luxor tombs belonging to the vizier Amenhotep IV. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities deemed this as conclusive evidence that Akhenaten and his father co-ruled for a minimum of 8 years, as determined by the tomb's dating. But nevertheless, other Egyptologists have raised doubts about this conclusion. They argue that the inscription merely indicates that construction on Amenhotep IV's tomb began during Amenhotep III's rule, and was simply completed under Akhenaten's reign. Therefore, Amenhotep IV likely intended to show his respect to both rulers, which is a pretty good idea, if you ask me. Well, Akhenaten did eventually ascend to the throne under the name of Amenhotep, most probably in 1353 or 1351, because do remember he didn't change his name till later on. The exact age of Amenhotep IV when he performed this action remains a little uncertain, but we do have estimates varying from 10 years old to 23 years old. It's probable that he was crowned in Thebes, and a little less probable that he was crowned in Memphis or Armant, but it may have happened. His initial reign adhered to the established customs and practices of the pharaohs. Business as usual, more or less. We don't know what he was thinking in the background. He did not promptly commence redirecting this adoration towards the Aten and creating distance between himself and other deities. His religious policies were not premeditated or part of a pre-existing plan, it seems, but rather developed slowly during his reign. Now, there is one Egyptologist, Donald B. Redford, that provides 3 pieces of evidence to substantiate this. Initially, extant inscriptions indicate that Amenhotep IV engaged in the act of venerating multiple deities. Pretty normal. We're talking the big ones: Atum, Anubis, Osiris, Hathor, the Eye of Ra, and all the dream team of the Egyptian pantheon. Also, the texts from this period do make mention of the gods, that is with a S on the end, and every god and every goddess. So certainly not a monotheistic practice. That the high priest of Amun remained actively involved during the 4th year of Amenhotep IV's reign. Furthermore, despite relocating his capital from Thebes to Akhenaten, which we'll get to later, the pharaoh initially paid tributes to Thebes in his royal title, referring to himself as Amenhotep, the divine ruler of Thebes. Acknowledging the significance of Thebes, he also referred to the city as Southern Heliopolis, the primary center of worship for the sun god Ra. Furthermore, he refrained from demolishing temples dedicated to other deities, and in fact, he carried on with his father's architectural endeavors at the precinct of Amun-Re in Karnak. This individual adorned the walls of the precinct's 3rd pylon with depictions of his own act of worship towards Ra, represented in the customary manifestation of a man with the head of a falcon. Well, during the early years of Amenhotep IV's reign, artistic representations remained pretty much unchanged. The tombs constructed or finalized during the initial years of his reign, such as those belonging to Keruef, Parenefer, and Ramose, exhibit the pharaoh depicted in the conventional artistic manner. Amenhotep is depicted on the west wall of Ramose's tomb, seated on a throne, while Ramose is shown in front of the pharaoh. On the opposite side of the doorway, there is a depiction of Amenhotep IV and Nefertiti in the window. Oh, by the way, I should have mentioned that his wife was Nefertiti. Should have name-dropped that earlier. Oh well, we're here now. Well, the Aten, represented as a sun disk, is also shown in these artworks. Now, Amenhotep IV and Nefertiti are depicted seating on a throne in Parenefer's tomb, with a sun disk placed above the pharaoh and his queen. Despite maintaining the worship of other deities, Amenhotep's primary objective in his initial construction project was to establish new religious sites dedicated to Aten. He commissioned the building of temples or shrines dedicated to the Aten in various cities throughout the country, including Bubastis, Tel el-Borg, Memphis, Heliopolis, and many other cities. In addition, he commissioned the establishment of an expansive temple compound devoted to the Aten in Karnak, located in Thebes, to the northeast of the sections of the Karnak complex dedicated to Amun. The Aten, also known as the Aten Temple Complex, was comprised of multiple temples with surviving names: the Gempaten, the Hit Benben, Rut Menu, Teni Menu, and the Seken Aten. He also arranged a Sed festival during his 2nd or 3rd regnal year. Now, what is a Sed festival? Well, there were ceremonial rituals performed to revitalize an aging pharaoh. They typically occurred for the first time around the 13th year of a pharaoh's rule, and then recurred approximately every 3 years. Egyptologists can only conjecture about the reasons behind Amenhotep IV's arrangement of a said festival, considering that he was probably still in his early 20s at the time, and really being that young, he shouldn't have needed much revitalizing. Well, several historians interpret this as proof of a joint rule between Amenhotep III and Amenhotep IV, suggesting that Amenhotep IV's said festival occurred at the same time as one of his father's festivities. Well, some theorize that he deliberately scheduled this festival 3 years after his father's passing, in order to assert that his rule was effectively an extension of his father's reign. The belief is also held that the festival was conducted to pay tribute to the Aten, the deity on whose behalf the pharaoh governed Egypt. Alternatively, it is believed that the said festival honored both the pharaoh and the god simultaneously. 2 birds, 1 stone, as Amenhotep III was considered to have merged with the Aten after his demise. Additionally, the ceremony may have served to symbolically imbue Amenhotep IV with vigor prior to his significant undertaking, i.e. the establishment of the Aten cult and the creation of the new capital, Akhenaten, which by the way means the Aten gleams or the Aten shines. Now, irrespective of the purpose of the celebration, Egyptologists assert that Amenhotep IV only presented offerings to the Aten, rather than the customary practice of making offerings to multiple gods and goddesses. It was all about the new kid in town. Well, there are 2 extant copies as well of a letter addressed to the pharaoh by Epi, the high steward of Memphis, and they're among the last documents that mention Akhenaten as Amenhotep IV. The discovered letters, located in Gurob, convey to the pharaoh that the royal estates in Memphis are in a state of good organization, and that the temple of Ptah is prosperous and doing quite well. These letters are specifically dated to the 5th year of the pharaoh's reign, on the 19th day of the 3rd month of the growing season, and approximately 1 month later, on the 13th day of the 4th month of the growing season, it is observed that one of the boundary stelae at Akhenaten already bore the name Akhenaten, indicating that the pharaoh had altered his name between the time of these 2 inscriptions. Thus, he changed his regal name as a manifestation of his unwavering love and dedication to the Aten. He would abandon that previous name of Amenhotep IV and completely disassociate himself from the god Amun, instead fully devoting himself to the worship of the Aten. Now, there is a discussion regarding the precise interpretation of Akhenaten as his newly adopted personal name. The term Ak has multiple possible translations, and it's a bit tricky. Some of them mean satisfied, effective spirit, or serviceable too. So we can pick from a few translations that are pretty much what he was getting at, whether that be serviceable to the Aten, the spirit of the Aten, or Aten is satisfied. Of course, when you put it back into the English, I suppose it doesn't make too much sense. I don't think back when he chose his name he was thinking about how it would be translated effectively. Well, simultaneously with his modification of his royal title, he issued a decree on the 13th day of the 4th month of the agricultural season, ordering the construction of a new capital city called Akhenaten, which translates to the horizon of the Aten, or the Aten gleams. These days they don't call it that, though. They call it Armana. Well, the most documented events in Akhenaten's life, according to Egyptologists, are relatable to the establishment of this city. Numerous boundary stelae were discovered around the city, serving as markers to define its limits. The pharaoh selected a location that was equidistant from Thebes, the contemporary capital, and Memphis, situated on the eastern bank of the Nile. Now this site was characterized by a wadi and a natural depression in the adjacent cliffs, which created a silhouette that resembled the horizon hieroglyph. Furthermore, the site had formerly been devoid of human habitation. Based on the inscriptions found on a boundary stela, the site was deemed suitable for the establishment of Aten city because it did not belong to any deity, ruler, or any group that could assert ownership to it. The reasons behind Akhenaten's decision to establish a new capital and abandon Thebes remain a little uncertain. The boundary stela that provided information about the establishment of Akhenaten are in a somewhat damaged state, particularly in the section that probably explained the reasons behind the pharaoh's decision to relocate, and that's a horrible tragedy, of course. The fragments that do survive assert that the events that transpired with Akhenaten were a little more severe than any of the previously reported during his reign, surpassing even the accounts heard by other monarchs. Now these fragments also imply the existence of derogatory remarks made against the Aten. Egyptologists suggest that Akhenaten may have been alluding to a confrontation with the clergy and adherents of Amun, the deity revered as the guardian of Thebes. And of course, those who were worshipping Amun and pretty much had an entire career around it were not too happy with the shake-up in the pantheon's leadership, that's to be sure. While the magnificent temples of Amun, including Karnak, were situated exclusively in Thebes. During the earlier period of the 18th dynasty, particularly under the reigns of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, the priests in Thebes gained significant influence. This was made possible by the pharaohs generously dedicating a substantial portion of Egypt's increasing wealth to the worship of Amun. Consequently, it's been suggested that Akhenaten's decision to establish a new capital may have simply been an attempt to distance himself from the powerful priests of Amun and the deity himself. Well, Akhenaten itself was a meticulously designed urban settlement, featuring the imposing Great Temple of the Aten and a few other smaller temples surrounded by opulent royal dwellings, an administrative hub for record-keeping, and all of the various governmental edifices, all situated within the very heart of the city. Akhenaten commissioned the construction of certain buildings, including the Aten temples, as stated in the boundary stela that established the city. The whole point of the city was to worship Aten. Well, it was rapidly constructed too, using novel construction techniques that employed significantly smaller building blocks compared to those used by previous pharaohs. The talatats, which were ancient Egyptian building blocks, had dimensions of about half by 1 cubits, which is approximately 27 by 27 by 54 centimeters. Due to their smaller weight and standardized size, they were more efficient to use in construction compared to heavier blocks of different sizes. By the 8th regnal year, Akhenaten had reached a level of development that allowed it to be inhabited by the royal family themselves. But Akhenaten and his family were only accompanied by their most devoted followers to the new city. Not everybody was keen to pack up and leave to live in the middle of the desert. Well, during the period from year 5 to year 8, construction activities in Thebes also started to decline. The construction of the Theban Aten temples was also halted, and the workers who were involved in building the tombs in the Valley of the Kings were moved to the workers' village at Akhenaten. Nevertheless, construction activities persisted in other regions of Egypt, as prominent religious hubs like Heliopolis and Memphis also witnessed the erection of temples dedicated to Aten. The Amarna letters have yielded significant evidence regarding Akhenaten's reign and his approach to foreign policy too. We have a cache that consists of 382 diplomatic texts, as well as literary and educational materials that were found between 1887 and 1979. The great thing about having a lot of these Near Eastern artifacts is many of them are carved on clay tablets. It makes it very handy to preserve them. It is referred to as the Amarna letters, named after the Akhenaten city's capital Akhenaten, which is now known as Amarna. The diplomatic correspondence consists of clay tablet messages exchanged among Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun. These messages cover a wide range of topics, including communication between Egyptian military outposts, discussions with rulers of vassal states, and interactions with foreign rulers. We're talking the big Bronze Age states: Babylonia, Assyria, Canaan, Arzawa, Mitanni, and even the Hittites up in Anatolia. Which, well, I guess the Hittites are my favorite. I like talking about the Hittites. Go watch my video on the Hittites. You'll enjoy it. Well, the Amarna letters depict the geopolitics of the Eastern Mediterranean that Akhenaten inherited from his predecessors. During the 2 centuries before Akhenaten became ruler, after the Hyksos were forced out of Lower Egypt at the end of the Second Intermediate Period, the kingdom's power and military strength grew significantly. Thutmose III, who reigned about a century before Akhenaten, significantly enhanced Egypt's influence through various military expeditions in Nubia and Syria. Egypt's territorial expansion resulted in a clash with the Mitanni, but this conflict ultimately concluded with the 2 nations forming an alliance. But gradually, the influence of Egypt began to diminish. Amenhotep III sought to preserve the equilibrium of power by strategically forming alliances through matrimonial unions, such as his marriage to Taduk-Hipa, the daughter of the Mitanni king Tushratta, and by establishing vassal states. During the reigns of Amenhotep III and Akhenaten, Egypt lacked the capacity or even the willingness to resist the emergence of the Hittite Empire in the region of Syria. During a period of shifting power among Egypt's neighboring states and rivals, the pharaohs appeared to deliberately avoid engaging in any kind of military conflict. Meanwhile, the Hittites were quite confrontational. They even had chariots, and they surpassed the Mitanni in terms of influence. Akhenaten displayed a clear concern regarding the growing influence of the Hittite Empire, led by Suppiluliuma I during the early years of his rule. You see, if the Hittites had successfully attacked Mitanni and its ruler Tushratta, it would have had significant impact on the international balance of power in the ancient Middle East. This was because Egypt had already made peace with Mitanni, and as a result, some of Egypt's vassals would have likely changed their loyalties and aligned with the Hittites, as subsequent events would demonstrate. A coalition of Egypt's allies, who made an unsuccessful attempt to revolt against the Hittites, were apprehended and taken care of. I'm sure they regretted that. Well, they composed letters imploring Akhenaten for military assistance, begging even, but he more or less just ignored them. He seemed to not care at all, too busy setting up his own little city. Indications point to the fact that the problems occurring on the northern border resulted in challenges in Canaan, specifically in a power struggle between Labaya of Shechem and Abdi Heba of Jerusalem. The situation necessitated the pharaoh's intervention in the region, who sent Magi troops northwards. Akhenaten deliberately declined to provide assistance to his vassal Ribhadar of Byblos, whose kingdom was under siege by the advancing state of Amurru, led by Abdi Ashirta, and later Aziru, the son of Abdi Ashirta. Despite Ribhadar's repeated appeals for help, the pharaoh chose to not intervene. Ribhadar corresponded with Akhenaten by writing a total of 60 letters, each one of them becoming increasingly more desperate for help. But Akhenaten ignored them all and even grew tired of the incessant letters, and he did reply once back, remarking to him, "You are the individual who writes to me more frequently than all the other mayors or Egyptian vassals." Ribhadar failed to understand that the Egyptian king had absolutely zero intention of mobilizing and sending a complete army to the north solely to maintain the existing political situation of a few insignificant little city-states on the outskirts of Egypt's Asiatic empire. Thus, Ribhadar was subjected to the most severe of consequence, his banishment from Byblos as a result of a coup orchestrated by his own brother, Ilirabi, as indicated in a single correspondence. After failing to receive assistance from Akhenaten, he sought help from Aziru, his sworn adversary, to regain his position as ruler of his city. But Aziru quickly sent him to the king of Sidon as a prisoner. And we don't really know what happened, but most likely he would have been paraded through the streets and eventually put to death once everybody had had enough fun jeering him. Well, Akhenaten's reign is only associated with one military campaign that is known with certainty. During his second or 12th year of his rule, commanded by his viceroy of Kush, Tuthmose, to lead a military campaign with the purpose of suppressing a rebellion and stopping the raids on Nile settlements by Nubian nomadic tribes. Nubians coming up from the south, by the way. Egyptians would often use them as mercenaries, though they were quite good fighters, which is added to the point where it gets a little bit scary when the Nubians are fighting against you rather than with you. Uno reverse card, I suppose. Well, anyway, Akhenaten was victorious, and the triumph was memorialized on two stelae, one unearthed at Amada and another at Buen. But there is disagreements among some Egyptologists regarding the scale of the campaign, as some believed it to be a relatively minor police operation, whereas others think it was a large-scale war. Let's cross our fingers and hope that we find some other tablets under the ground somewhere. I'm sure there's plenty still out there, buried, waiting to be found. That's what's so fascinating about Bronze Age archaeology, because we know that the clay tablets, they stick around for so long. At any moment, you could be walking through the Near or Middle East, or Egypt, and you could just come across one of these great little tablets under the ground, just as they did with the Rosetta Stone. We never know what we're going to find. But there are alternative opinions that have been put forward by Egyptologists that propose that Akhenaten may have engaged in military conflict in Syria or the Levant, potentially targeting the Hittites. Cyril Aldred, based on the Amun letters detailing Egyptian military maneuvers, suggests that Akhenaten initiated an ill-fated conflict in the vicinity of Gezer. Conversely, Mark Gabolde contended for an unsuccessful expedition near Kadesh. That is the Kadesh of the battle from Ramesses II, by the way. Now, one of the campaigns mentioned on Tutankhamun's restoration stela could be the military expedition to Tiye, which aimed to expand Egypt's territory in southern Canaan and Syria. However, this campaign seems to have been ultimately unsuccessful. John Coleman Darnell and Colleen Manasseh contended that Akhenaten engaged in a conflict with the Hittites over the dominion of Kadesh, but his efforts proved to be fruitless. The city remained under Hittite control until Seti I recaptured it, and that was about 60 or 70 years later. But in general terms, archaeological findings indicate that Akhenaten closely monitored the activities of Egyptian vassals in Canaan and Syria. However, he primarily relied on reports from government officials and agents rather than correspondence like the letters discovered at Amarna. He successfully maintained Egypt's dominion over its central Near Eastern empire, encompassing present-day Israel and the Phoenician coast, without engaging in hostilities with the formidable and assertive Hittite Empire led by Suppiluliuma I. The Hittites had surpassed the Mitanni as the dominant force in the northern area of the region. The Hittites only managed to capture the Egyptian border province of Amurru in Syria, however, located near the Orontes River, and this happened when Aziru, the ruler of Amurru, switched his allegiance to the Hittites. Akhenaten summoned Aziru to come to Egypt, but eventually released him after receiving a promise of loyalty. Well, Aziru, however, quickly betrayed this promise and went running straight back to Suppiluliuma. Well, we don't have much knowledge regarding the final 5 years of Akhenaten's rule, which commenced around 1341 or 1339. The historical records from these years are pretty scarce, with only a small number of existing contemporary evidence remaining. The limited amount of information makes it very challenging to reconstruct what was actually going on. Consequently, the topic is highly debated and even controversial among Egyptologists. We don't want to go into any fan fiction, because that would just be silly. But we can talk about the little bits of evidence that we have and engage in some educated guesses. Yeah, Let's use that word instead. But one of the most recent pieces of evidence is an inscription found in 2012 at a limestone quarry in Deir el-Bersha, which is located just north of Akhenaten. The inscription dates back to the 16th year of the pharaoh's reign. The text pertains to a construction endeavor in Amarna, and it confirms that Akhenaten and Nefertiti were still a reigning couple, merely 1 year prior to Akhenaten's demise. The inscription is dated to the 16th year, 3rd month of Akhet, and the 15th day of the reign of Akhenaten. Prior to 2012 unearthing of the inscription, most of the recent documented events with a specific date in Akhenaten's reign was ceremonial gathering in the 12th year of his rule. During this event, the pharaoh and his royal family were presented with gifts and offerings from allied nations and subordinate states at Akhenaten. The inscriptions display acknowledgments from Nubia, the land of Punt, Syria, the kingdom of Hattusa, and the islands in the Mediterranean Sea and Libya. This year 12 celebration is regarded as a pinnacle of Akhenaten's rule, and historians have gained knowledge about the presence of the royal family, consisting of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their 6 daughters, at the royal reception through the reliefs found in the tomb of the courtier Merye II. Nevertheless, it's kind of uncertain regarding the factors that contributed to the reception. Possible events include the commemoration of the union between the future pharaoh I and Tiye, the observance of Akhenaten's 12-year reign, the summoning of King Aziru of Amuru to Egypt, the triumphant military conquest at Sumur in the Levant, a successfully military expedition in Nubia, Nefertiti's rise to power as co-regent, and also the finalization of the construction of the new capital Akhenaten. Well, after completing year 12, it is suggested that Egypt was affected by an epidemic, most probably a plague. Current evidence indicates that a devastating plague spread throughout the Middle East during this period, and it is possible that ambassadors and delegations who attended Akhenaten's 12th year reception introduced the disease to Egypt, carrying it in with them. Alternatively, correspondence from the Hattians may indicate that the epidemic had its source in Egypt and was subsequently spread across the Middle East by Egyptian prisoners of war. Well, irrespective of its source, the epidemic may have caused multiple deaths within the royal family during these final 5 years of Akhenaten's reign, including 3 of his daughters, Aten, Neferne Furude, and Setet Penre. Akhenaten may have co-ruled with Smenkhare and Nefertiti for several years before his death. Smenkhare may have served as Akhenaten's co-regent around the 13th or 14th year of his reign, but passed away after a few years. Nefertiti's assumption of the co-regent role may have occurred after the 16th year, as indicated by a stela still referring to her as Akhenaten's great royal wife. The familial connection between Nefertiti and Akhenaten is also established, but it remains uncertain whether they shared a blood relationship. They may have been very far-removed cousins, something like this. Smenkhare's possible familial relationship to Akhenaten is also uncertain, as he could have been neither his son nor elder brother. In terms of archaeological evidence, it suggests that Smenkhare was married to Aten, the eldest daughter of Akhenaten. And we also have the Co-Regencies stela found in a tomb at Akhenaten, which may depict Nefertiti as Akhenaten's co-regent. Akhenaten's reign lasted for 17 years, and he was first interred in a tomb located in the royal wadi to the east of Akhenaten. The directive to build the tomb and inter the pharaoh was recorded on a boundary stela marking the limits of the capital. It stated that a tomb shall be constructed for Akhenaten in the eastern mountain. It requested that the burial take place within the millions of jubilees that were ordained for him by his father Aten. And after the burial, Akhenaten's sarcophagus was damaged and abandoned at the Akhenaten necropolis. But don't worry, it was later restored in the 20th century, and it's currently housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, at least as of 2019. Although Akhenaten's sarcophagus was left behind, his mummy was taken out of the royal tombs after Tutankhamun left Akhenaten and went back to Thebes. It is probable that it was relocated to the tomb KV-55 in the Valley of the Kings near Thebes. But of course, it was violated later on, most probably in the Ramesside era. Well, following the death of Akhenaten, the Aten cult pretty much fell apart completely, leading Tutankhaten to change his name to Tutankhamun and completely desert Akhenaten, along with everybody else. His successors attempted to expunge him and his family from the historical archives. Under Horemheb, the final pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, Egyptians destroyed temples dedicated to the Aten and repurposed building materials for the new construction projects, including those for the newly reinstated deity Amun. That's right, he's back. Seti I, the successor of Horemheb, restored monuments dedicated to Amun and re-engraved the god's name on inscriptions. He removed Akhenaten, Smenkhare, Nefer-Nehuaten, and Tutankhamun from official pharaoh lists to create the illusion that Amenhotep III was directly followed by Horemheb. And during the reign of the Ramessids, Akhenaten was systematically dismantled, and its building materials were repurposed, including in Hermopolis construction projects. Unfavorable sentiments towards Akhenaten were demonstrated through inscriptions in the tomb of the scribe Mose, where Akhenaten's rule is described as the time of the enemy of Akhenaten. Well, according to Egyptologists, the reign of Akhenaten and the Amarna period initiated a gradual deterioration in the authority of the Egyptian government and the status of the pharaoh in Egyptian society and religious aspects. Akhenaten's religious reforms undermined those traditional connections that ordinary Egyptians had with their deities and the pharaoh, as well as the function of the pharaoh in mediating between the people and the gods. Prior to the period of Amarna, the pharaoh held the role of being the earthly representative of the gods. They were considered the offspring of the deity Ra and embodied the god Horus. The pharaoh fulfilled their divine duties by performing rituals, making offerings, and ensuring the upkeep of the temples dedicated to the gods. In addition, despite the pharaoh's supervision of all religious activities, Egyptians had the opportunity to connect with their gods through customary public holidays, festivals, and processions. As a result, there appeared to be a strong bond between individuals and the gods, particularly the patron deity of their specific town and cities. Akhenaten, however, prohibited the veneration of deities other than the Aten, including during religious celebrations. In addition, he proclaimed himself as the exclusive authority to worship the Aten, and mandated that all religious reverence previously shown to the other deities should actually be redirected towards him. Well, following his death during the 19th and 20th dynasties, which spanned approximately 270 years, the dynamic between the people, the pharaoh, and the gods just didn't get back to the previous state and belief from before the time when Akhenaten kind of screwed everything up for everybody, if I may use those non-academic terms. Although the worship of all deities went back to how it was before, the connection between the gods and their followers became more immediate and intimate, bypassing the involvement of the pharaoh. Instead of relying on the pharaoh as an intermediary, a kind of middleman, Egyptians began to hold the belief that they could simply talk directly to the gods, and that the gods intervened directly within their lives, safeguarding the righteous and penalizing the wrongdoers. The deities assumed the role of their own envoys on earth, supplanting the pharaoh. What about Amun? Well, he regained his position as the supreme ruler among all of the deities. The king, however, ceased to be considered as such, as now God himself has assumed the role of king no more. Once Amun was acknowledged as the legitimate ruler, the political authority of the earthly leaders could be significantly diminished. As a result, the Amun priesthood's influence and authority steadily increased until the 21st dynasty, around 1077 BC. And when they were at that point, the high priests of Amun essentially became rulers, albeit de facto ones, over their own little regions of Egypt. And that's all I have for you, for Akhenaten. What a fascinating creature he is, or was. Well, thank you to the top-tier patrons and supporters, Britt, Charles, Stoke Factory, JC, Jeffrey, Wendy, Tim, James, Erin, Scott, Gary, Dark, Ben, Melissa. Dearly beloved supporters, thank you very much. And thank you for listening so far. More Egypt videos to come. I know you like them. I like them too. So I will see you next time. Lots of love to you all. Sincerely. See you tomorrow.